Hello and welcome to another Frontend Engineering Explained. So in this one I'm going to talk a little bit about typography. And so when you're choosing the typography for your website, you might kind of leave this to chance. You might pick it based on what feels right as you're designing something in a design program of your choice. Or you might just play around with some sizes in the browser as you look at maybe a page like a blog article or something like that. But then when you look at some other sites, you might feel like there's almost as if there's a kind of rhythm to how their headings are set and their paragraph text and maybe the footnotes and little things like that. And that is not by chance. That is because if you inspect their code, you'll most likely find that they're using a type scale. So let me show you what a type scale is by using this tool called typescale.com. And essentially what a type scale is it uses a base, and then from there it scales up the size of the fonts based on a ratio or a increment or a scaling factor, if you will. Now, for example, if you see here, we're working off of a base of 16 pixels, which is what most people's base font size is set to in their browser if they didn't change it at all. Of course, they can. Now, even if they do, the scaling factor doesn't change, but of course, your fonts might get really big depending on the scaling factor you choose. Now, as you'll see, there's quite a couple here. And they use like musical term naming, like major second, major third, perfect fourth, and then the golden ratio there right at the top. Now, and what this means is in between each step that the font is going larger, the step between each is 1.125 or 1.333 or whatever the case might be. So you can, for example, see we're at the smallest scale factor now. So the amount or the increase in size for each step is very small. But if we now go to, let's say, for example, augmented fourth, you can see that the size of the H1 is now much bigger than, for example, the H6. And also the jump from H2 to H1 is also very big. And sometimes you want this for effect, maybe for a specific design, that kind of thing. You might need these font sizes to really grow really big and also have a lot of space in between the two. But also something that you often are going to want to do is, for example, you'd want a different size for mobile or a different scaling factor for mobile than you'd want for desktop. I mean, as you can see here, like this is clearly way too big for mobile. It's even too big for desktop in this specific layout. But maybe, if we go down to 1.250, maybe we can even go up to 1.33. Maybe you have I really want my headings to pop on desktop. But then if you go down and say, well, that's way too big for mobile, let's go maybe down 2 ones. You're like, yeah, that's kind of nice. So for mobile, I reckon a 1.2 or a minor third is going to be good. And then I want to use a perfect fourth on desktop or on larger viewports. So how do we then translate that over into code? Well, as you can see, this gives us the rem units. It also gives us the pixel values, but we're going to work with rem. And of course, if we switch between the two, we can see the differences. So we can transfer that into something like this, where we basically have our default at 1 rem, and then we have our typography sizes: tiny, small, small, medium, medium, large, extra large, XXL, and then display, which is really big. That's like, your H1 would be XXL, and display would be when you really want that heading that just pops maybe in your hero or on your landing page or something like that. So you'd use this one very sparingly. And then we would do almost all of them, except you could bring down tiny and small as well. Maybe you want to leave them there as just the same across small and larger viewports. And then over here, we'll then redefine small all the way to display for our other scale. And then we'll use these variables and we'll assign them to our different heading levels, to paragraphs, and then we'll have specific classes for our typography small and typography tiny. And then, of course, now we just have something like this. And then if we go into the browser, now we can see here's our typography with that nice rhythm on mobile. And as you can see, they're bigger here on desktop. Thing is, what if maybe tomorrow you decide, you know what, this is actually too big. I want to go down one scaling factor. Now, you'll have to change the values of each one of these individually. Of course, because we're using custom properties, this is much nicer than having to find all the instances of 5.61 rem across your entire code base and changing it. But, you know, it's still quite a couple of places you need to change this. And what if you decided that actually you want the mobile ones to also be different? Well, then you have to obviously update all of these as well. Again, not something you do every day, but, you know, you might want to do this. So what if I told you there is an easier way that you can do this? And there is, and that's thanks to the calc function in CSS. So let's have a look at how we will change how we do this and then what the benefit is at the end of the day over how we have it right now. So we'll start off by creating typography, and then we'll say scale factor, right? And we'll start with 1.2. This is what we want on mobile. So instead of having our hard-coded value here, we're going to use the calc function. So what we'll do is we'll say calc, and then we'll use, here we won't use our default as AI is suggesting, but instead we'll use small, and then we'll divide that by our scaling factor. Now for this one down here, we will use default because that's the one size just larger than where we're at, and we'll divide that by our scaling factor. And now we're going the other way. So for these, what we'll do is we'll calc again, but this time we'll multiply by our scaling factor. So we'll start from default, multiply by our scaling factor. And now each time we go up here, we're going to multiply by the previous one, right? Because we want to go that scaling factor bigger than the previous. So instead of default here, we'll have small, not small default, small medium, right? And then for this one, we would have medium. And for this one, we would have large, XL, and lastly, XXL. Now, all we need to do on desktop is we copy this, right? Before I show you, let's just go back here, because now we've changed all our mobile sizes, right? And we can see this still looks the same. This also still looks the same. Now, if I comment this out, of course, now our headings here are the same as on mobile. All we have to do to change this is take our scaling factor, bring that down here, and override this to be 1.333, for example. And as you can see, our mobile is still the same, but now our desktop has bumped by that 1.33. So that's all we need to do. So now in the future, if we decide, well, actually, you know what? We really want our headings to pop. So let's go for 1.414. We change it here, and it's bumped. Mobile is still the same. Let's say for some reason we want our mobile to be really, really small. So 1.125, for example. We change that here. And now our mobile ones is much smaller. Here we still have the big ones. So now instead of having to change all of these things, we're literally just changing two scaling factors. And by changing those scaling factors, everything changes across the board. And we never have to rethink or recalculate all these things or copy and paste things around. The reason why I didn't bring, for example, small and tiny is because if you, for example, look at, let's say the small and tiny size here, 0.889, 0.79. Now, if we go up to, for example, perfect fourth, you can see because of the same effect, it gets much smaller, much quicker. And for me, I feel like this is probably too small. And I feel like at, for example, 1.2 here, like this is small enough for tiny. This is already kind of really small, but this is small enough for small. This is small enough for tiny for me. I don't feel that I need or want to change that for desktop. So I generally tend to just keep these the same across all viewports. And then the only ones where I change is basically for these guys. Now, of course, if you do it with just this, then it will, of course, also override your tiny and small. So in those cases, you might want to actually hard code these so that they're not being calculated. Because right now, if we look here, you can see the tiny text here is much, much smaller than the tiny text there. And so what you could do if you do decide to have those be fixed, then of course you can just use the raw values there. So instead of doing our calc here for tiny, we'll just use 0.694 rem. And then for the other one, 0.833 rem. And now if we go back to our example here, we can see our small and tiny text is exactly the same, but then we have this noticeable difference between our desktop and our smaller viewports. So that is how you can now have easy swapping and changing and playing around with different ideas. That's also the nice thing if you want to like play around maybe a little bit, like what does 1.414 feel like on desktop? Oh, that's actually too big, or it's not big enough. I actually wanted that display one to really be big. You can now easily do that by literally changing the scale factor in one place, and it updates everywhere. And if you're not happy, you can just scale it down again, and the same goes for mobile. So I hope you found this interesting and useful, that you'll start using TypeScales and that you'll play around and also try out the calc and see what other ways you can use calc. And of course, there's another function that you can use in combination with this kind of thing for fluid typography, which is the clamp function. And I will look at that soon in another video. Until then, peace.